What are our oldest stories? When I talk about these on this channel, I often mention creation myths and flood myths, perhaps even dragon myths. But what if one of our oldest stories is something far more unsettling? What I'm about to tell you now is a tale of a lone traveller who loses his way, drifts beyond the human world into mythical lands, and survives a series of seemingly impossible encounters with monsters and cannibals, and all whilst avoiding falling rocks and, well, the strange land itself. This story is interesting because it is not found in just one place, but we see fragments of it that have survived and told in many of the world's cultures. We hear parts of it in the oral traditions of the Inuit and Native Americans, in sacred songs from Russia, in Greek epics, and even in Chinese legend. It is a story with a version you are almost certainly aware of because of its popularity, but until now, not many have considered the story itself to be over 3,000 years old. This is the story on which Homer's The Odyssey was written. Now, many believe the story of the Odyssey was written around 750 to 650 BCE, making it almost 2,800 years old. Now, I'm not here to say this specific story is much older than what most academics think. The story of the Odyssey isn't, but what I am going to tell you is that it was not an original story. And this is what I will talk about today: the origins of a story on which the Odyssey was built. And that story is very old indeed. And I believe this is the first time this story has ever been told on video. I'm John White. I'm an academic who specialises in Indo-European mythology, and I'm best known for this YouTube channel, Crackenfold, where I discuss our oldest stories, as well as the curator of the Folklore Database, which is a source of hundreds of thousands of narratives that can be searched in many ways, and is used by hundreds of universities and thousands of researchers in the study of the origins of folklore and history of anthropology and sociology. And my work is possible because of you, your support, your likes, your subscribes and membership of my YouTube channel and Patreon. So thank you. And so if you want to hear more about this story, written and told by a human face who you can see, then grab yourself a cup of tea and welcome to Crackenfold. In this video, we're going to ask the question, is the story of Odysseus and his adventure of 10 years of him trying to get home whilst dealing with monsters and gods, well, was this story being told over 20,000 years ago? And the best place to start, I think, is by introducing you to the Odyssey. And it starts like this. Tell me, my muse, of the man of many devices who wandered astray after he had sacked the sacred city of Troy. Many were the men whose cities he saw and whose mind he learned, and many the woes he suffered in his heart upon the sea, seeking to win his own life and the return of his comrades. Yet, even so, he saved not his comrades, though he much desired it, but through their own blind folly they perished, the fools he took from them the day of their returning. And this is how the Homeric epic of the Odyssey starts, a story that tells of one man's journey to get home, but which was stifled by the god Poseidon. But to explain it further, I'll tell you the start of a few other stories. First, imagine an Inuit man. He's paddling a small kayak away from his land in the Arctic, and he disappears into fog and distance. And whilst in this fog, he is taken away from this ordinary world into another realm beyond the familiar shores he is used to. He continues to paddle, looking for somewhere to stop, and he eventually sees a house near the shore. And there he pitches his kayak and walks towards the house, and inside, a young woman lives with her mother. At first he thinks it may be a refuge as there are no men around, which seems odd, and how can these two women survive on their own? he is offered a drink and a little food, and they suggest he rests. As he lays, the young woman lays next to him, and he becomes distracted. And there, right then, the truth emerges. He feels something isn't right, and despite the objections of the young woman, he turns around in bed. Before him, the mother stands, but now she is naked, and her body is monstrous. But on her back she has spines and a short tail, and she tries to kill the man. He jumps out the way, grabs his clothes, and leaps through a closed door. He enters a room, and there a few half-eaten bodies of men lay. He has been tricked into the home of man-eating women, man-eating monstrous women. And he sees a small window in the room and leaps through it and runs to his kayak and escapes. Then he travels farther, and for many weeks he's sailing between icebergs that are trying to crush him before he encounters more cannibalistic people, monstrous women, and people who try to throw him off a cliff and into the sea. He ends up finding a beautiful girl who he marries, but soon flees her. He travels around various landscapes, avoiding traps and traitors, monstrous and madmen, and risking his life most nights just to find sleep, not knowing if his hosts will try and do something terrible to him. Now, let's go to a different story in the Mediterranean. And here, a man's ship is blown off course because of a huge storm. He eventually reaches some islands, but again soon finds out they are not of this world. Their inhabitants are strange and dangerous, and most want to kill him and his crew. He meets creatures called the Lotus Eaters, Cyclops, and the Lastrygonians, Circe, the Dead, the Sirens. He goes to Helios Islands, Calypso he meets, and finally he finds people who can help him return home. He's not simply travelling islands in a sea. He's moving through a chain of thresholds between the human world and the world beside it. And if you recognise this story, then it is because it's a synopsis of the Odyssey by Homer. But we're not done, because if we go to the First Nation tribes in North America, we find there a story where a traveller is wandering. But interestingly, they are not lost. They are wandering around hoping to find safety. And in this version of the story, the traveller is someone of power, and he travels through a known landscape. He does not fear the monsters, for as he travels, he domesticates the world. And in one specific First Nation American tradition, he fixes things. He corrects beings that are malformed. He sets species of animals as we know them today in their present form. He repairs the anatomy, and he can turn people into animals and stones as well. And with that, he ties mythical narrative directly to places in the landscape. And if then we go to Eastern Europe, we meet St. George, the Dragon Slayer. And here we find a narrative which talks about how he has the power to command forests to part, for mountains to stop crushing, for wolves to scatter, and for fire-breathing snakes to become ordinary snakes. In southern China, we find the character of Lu Yin, moving through a landscape of named places, altering the world by speech and curse. And these last few examples of narrative are not stories about being lost. These are stories about reordering reality. But together, these stories are of wanderers and of travellers who transform. But for us, the big question is to do with these stories, and are their similarities random? The kind of things that humans naturally invent over again, possibly due to an archetype. Is that why we see these similar stories around? Or are there traces, now distorted, localised, rewritten, but traces of a very old story that was already being told before the settlement of the Americas was complete? And this is the real question, and one that I will answer by using a paper by Yuri Berezkin. And in my opinion, he is one of the world's leading comparative mythologists, and he'll help answer this question. And I'll link the paper in the description along with other papers I've used to create this video. if you wish to read it. So, the paper, by the way, is in Russian, but there are tools available on the internet to translate it, so that shouldn't be an issue. So let me talk about his paper briefly. Now, Berezkin identifies two key motifs as part of his work. The first is called The Wanderer and has a reference of L135 in the folklore database. And if you look at the dispersal map, you'll see it is across much of northern North America and northern parts of South America. And the second motif he discusses is B28, the travelling transformer. And if you look at that dispersal map, you'll see it is in central and northern parts of South America and on the west coast of North America. Now, for reference, the folklore database is a free-to-use website, and you can use it to find a motif. And to do that, you must log in, and there you select Browse Berezkin's motifs from the menu. You can scroll down to find the reference, or to speed things up, select the appropriate letter from the quick navigation menu at the top. And so if we wanted to look at B28, we would select B, and a short scroll down, we find B28. And if we select it, we can see lots of information about that motif, that it has 6 sub-motifs, for example. We can see its geographical dispersal, and then further down, we can see examples of stories. And if you select the magnifying glass icon at the end of any one of these, then it will zoom in and tell you more about that specific story, where it is told, and the source of that data. And you can export the reference of this story to use in any research you want to do in the future, so you can remember where you found it. And I want to thank my patrons and YouTube members who support directly funds the work that builds and maintains this database. So thank you. Now, if we go back to Berezkin's work, his central argument about the origin of the motif is that not that the Greeks borrowed it from, let's say, the Inuit, or that the First Nation American myths are derivative of Eurasian literature. His claim is more careful than that. And to me, I think what he comes to is a natural conclusion, even though the answer is probabilistic, because nothing is certain when dealing with this data, as many things could be possible. It's just some things are more likely given the sort of the amount and quantity of data and the distribution of that data. But the bottom line is that most computational comparative mythologists who use data to argue in the comparison of motifs, well, that data uses a very large number of motifs across a very large geographic area, like the whole world. And by doing that, you can see pattern distributions that are unlikely to be accidental or random. And these patterns often reflect migrations, and the patterns can be backed up with evidence from linguistic, evolution, and genetics, and through archaeology. Now, in this specific paper, although Berezkin was focused on the Wanderer and the travelling transformer, he also notes that there are more than 1,500 motifs identified in the New World mythology, so think of the Americas, and of those, approximately 1,000 of them have correspondences in Eurasian mythology. And his view, and it is shared by myself and many others, is that some of these correspondences are not best explained by sheer coincidence, but by a deeper historical inheritance, and that has survived human migrations as people went across the world, and in these particular cases from Eurasia into the Americas at the last glacial maximum, when there was a land bridge across Thuringia. And this is an important point, because what we are not doing here is old-fashioned comparative mythology, which is based on a few hand-picked, biased curiosities that where we think stories sound familiar. We see this in books like The Hero with 1,000 Faces or The Golden Bough. Those are particularly biased work which ignored sort of a whole general group of data. The Berezkin analytical catalogue doesn't have that bias. It has over 3,400 motifs in it from across the world. And whilst Berezkin's work is predominantly in Russian, so it's difficult to understand, I have translated the work and I fixed hundreds of errors in the data and added tens of thousands more narratives, included geospatial reporting. And so you can view all this in the folklore database. This is real data you can use. The result is a data set that shows we're not dealing with one-off stories. We are dealing with hundreds and thousands of instances across the whole world with recognizable distribution patterns, matching migrations and societal evolution in many cases. So this is the data set we use, and why we don't think this is just a coincidence. These stories, in terms of the Wanderer and the Travelling Transformer, well, the aim is to show that these stories aren't luck. Where they appear, that there is a connection. So let's start with the Wanderer and what it really is about, because the Wanderer motif is a simple story structure where a human leaves a home, often by accident. It is not a planned journey, and they get taken off course and into an unknown place. The main character has no control over this, and on their journey they encounter various figures. Some are bizarre, some outright hostile, and some look human but act in monstrous ways. There are animals with their own societies behaving like humans, and we see what should be inanimate objects come to life, such as statues. We see creatures block paths and guard entrances and exits. And if we stand back and look at actually what is happening, we see that the world is in two parts. You have the world where the human lived, where they started, the normal world, but then there is this other world, this world of monsters and mythical beings, a separate world from the normal one, but one that cannot be accessed deliberately. It requires a traveller to come across it by chance. In an Eastern Inuit version of the story, the Wanderer is a human, often called Kiviok, a character who appears in a number of Inuit narratives. You can search his name in the database. In the most northern of these traditions, he is seen as one who travelled, the one who sailed, the one who went around the world. And if we look at narratives of South America, here we see a hunter who gets lost, or a warrior who is separated from his group, or a traveller taken off their path. But the structure of the story is similar. It's recognisable. In these stories, a man hears threatening voices at night. He crosses rivers on the back of caiman, which are like alligators or crocodiles, smaller. And he does this by flattering them, but once he crosses, he insults them. He tries to acquire the possessions of some bird-like beings, such as fire or bedding, but they will fly off with them. And he has these kind of challenges, but eventually an animal will point him the way home. So the stories are different. The episodes do vary, but the underlying narrative remains the same, what we call the mythemes. These are parts of a story that take a particular action and phrase it in a way that stops it from being corrupted through translation or cultural migration. So, you say there was heavy rain, there was a monster with 10 legs. You can capture these components, and you'll find that they're often repeated. And depending on how you define your mytheme and the size of it, then these are the things we use to compare stories. So we have a story of a traveller, and they leave home, they go somewhere by accident, they come across these dangerous things, and then they get home again. So that is the shape of the story, and that is what we continue to see. And this is what we look for in comparative mythology. You see, now the stories are different. So whilst they have key components that are the same, if you hear the stories, they may sound a bit different on the surface because stories change with landscape and society. Otherwise, a story stops making sense, especially if it travels or cultures change. For example, a story told in the desert may not make any sense to people who live in mountains. But the things that happen in the story, not the who or where, the things that happen, the mythemes, often persist. And this is what we look for. And so in this narrative, we see that the traveller leaves the known world. The world he enters becomes progressively stranger. Survival depends on cunning and nerve and luck. And the traveller has to overcome monsters by outwitting them or escaping them or killing them, and the story ends with the traveller either returning home, but sometimes the versions of the stories we have is just the story just ends because there are some incomplete versions. But if we look at all these narratives from the Americas, in the paper, Berezkin spotted two clear major Eurasian analogues. One is Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus travels home after the Trojan War and is blown off course and his famous adventure begins. But the other one is the story of Theseus. And although Theseus, his story has been applied to a known place, a Greek landscape and known enemies, both are travellers, although Odysseus' version of the story he is a clearer wanderer, but they have to overcome various dangers, where Theseus is more about just clearing the way of monsters, but they are analogues. But it would be fair to say that the story of Odysseus is far more aligned with those American narratives. But that doesn't matter, as will become clear a little later on. Now let me talk about the other motif, the transformer. So the other narrative identified in Berezkin's paper is the transformer, and in the stories of the transformer, the traveller is not lost, but instead he travels through a often familiar world with known places. The traveller is strong and powerful and does not have the vulnerability that the wanderer suggests. And as they travel, they go from place to place and they impose order on things. How changing the way a creature looks into the shape we are familiar with today. They turn dangerous animals into harmless ones. They fix the landscape. They create rules about life, even defining things such as birth, sex, and death. We see such stories in the First Nation American tribes of North America, particularly on the western northwest coast, such as in the traditions of the Salish Cows, where a travelling figure transforms dangerous and malformed beings, and these actions are tied to particular locations in the landscape. In South America, we see similar stories, although sometimes the traveller is associated with the moon, but still transformed creatures and the landscapes. These stories are not about heroes fighting monsters, but heroes controlling, or perhaps better saying, domesticating the world and the cosmos. Now, with this in mind, Berezkin identifies the Eurasian story of St. George the Brave as a classic transformer narrative, an analogue of these. And this is an Eastern Slavic tradition. And in the story, St. George stops mountains crushing people, he parts forests and scatters wolves and turns fire-breathing snakes into normal snakes. Here, the world begins unstable with monstrous beings and danger all around, and ends in a more stable world which humans can inhabit. This is a narrative that is remarkably close to the American transformer narrative. But that isn't the only Eurasian story like this. There are others. One is in southern China with the story of Luo Yin, a historical poet who has folklore associated with him that says he moved through named places and leaves a transformed reality in his wake. He changes pagodas and the fate of households, even affecting an echo in a cave. This is not a story of a man amongst monsters, but a powerful traveller who moved through the land to make it what we see today. It is at this point that I normally start receiving comments on my video about, surely this is just coincidence. And so I'll say two things. Firstly, please like and subscribe the video. It means a lot. It's free to do, and you're rewarded in a video written and researched by a real person who is otherwise getting drowned out by a plethora of mindless, faceless, AI scripted videos. And so if you do that, thank you very much. But my second point, and more important to this video, is that the research isn't saying, look, there is a monster in these two stories, they must be the same. That is not persuasive to anyone. I am saying, look at the distribution of these stories. Yes, people should ask how we know that similar stories didn't rise independently, especially as they occur in different continents. And that's a fair challenge, because it is true, whatever I present, individual invention by a specific culture at a specific location cannot be completely ruled out. Cannot. And this is why you will find me talking about probabilities, that certain outcomes are more likely to be true than others, given the evidence we have. And so within comparative mythology, this dataset with its thousands of motifs and hundreds of thousands of narratives, where we select 2 of them within this dataset, we are tracking hundreds of stories. This is not just 1 or 2 examples. It is hundreds of stories. And when we examine how they're clustered and distributed in historical and meaningful ways, so chance and multiple one-offs, well, in that kind of data, they stop being probable. Instead, we see a significance in the whole, in the aggregate of the data. That something that is spread across a larger geographic area, something more significant is going on. Now, for the Wanderer and the Transformer, we see that they are not spread evenly across Eurasia, especially when compared to the Americas. In effect, the occurrences of these motifs in Eurasia only occur on what you could consider the margins of Western Eurasia and the Far East, with much of Central Eurasia lacking any good analogues. But in the Americas, the pattern shows dispersal across Northwestern and Western America, across Canada and into South America. And in South America, it's predominantly east of the Andes. And these occurrences do not look like random occurrences, of similar stories. It's more probable that these stories have been inherited and are residue of an older story that has survived, although unevenly as populations have migrated and split and erased, been overwritten by newer cultural formations. And it's that last part, this overwritten by newer cultures, that is important. And Berezkin says this, that the American traditions are not simply frozen in Eurasia, but they take on an American flavour, which spread locally and developed locally. That isn't what is going on here. His claim is that in these widespread clusters in the Americas, which have rare but strikingly similar analogues in Eurasia, then these may preserve the ancient inheritance of the narrative that later disappeared from most of the inner Eurasian cultures. This is not an argument against indigenous creativity, rather that indigenous traditions may preserve parts of a narrative in addition to their own later innovations. The stories aren't maintained as they were told at their very origin, but key aspects of them do survive, whilst other parts change or get overwritten as society and the landscape changes. So, I often hear people outside of this field telling me that stories can't be preserved for tens of years, let alone hundreds of thousands of years. And in some respects, this can be true because the world around you changes. And if the stories do not change with the world around you, they become irrelevant and lost. And I've written an essay about this, which I have shared on YouTube and Patreon platforms, which references many papers if you're interested in the study of why narratives persist. And what we find is that there are additional papers as well, which Berezkin references in his paper. And let me go through a few of these so you can understand the evidence we have from peer-reviewed papers about the persistence of narratives. Now, one of these is a 2016 phylogenetic study of Indo-European folktales, where the distribution of them correlated more strongly with population history as opposed to geographic proximity. And this is exactly the kind of research that keeps comparative mythology alive. And I'll link all these below, by the way. But it's basically saying stories don't just persist close to them, they persist with cultures as they migrate. And then there's a 2017 study where it was looked at the storytelling of the Agta hunter-gatherers of the Philippines. And it was shown that these storytelling times were not trivial pieces of entertainment. They were a social function, a system for explaining normal behaviours and cooperation. And around 70% of actor stories about cross-foraging concern social behaviour and norms and expectations, all of which suggest it is part of a template on which societies and cultures use to educate new generations of humans as they grew up in that culture. Now, as humans, I should have used the word children, but I think we know what I mean. My head is in a space. Anyway, this research also agreed that folk narratives can be highly conserved, and so suggesting narratives can persist for a very long time. And I hope this information, along with all my work on the YouTube channel and the folklore database, means that this type of research can be taken seriously. It also means that storytelling is adaptive. It is socially valuable, can be conserved historically, and so it is not beyond reason to believe that some narratives, or at least the core myth-themes of those narratives, can travel with cultures over a long time and vast distances whilst keeping their form. But this is not the whole story. There is another half to this argument. So in 2025, there was a study on the Quechuan oral tradition, which warned against overly neat cultural evolution models by showing how storytellers reshaped motifs and even recombined entire folk tales in response to the community, the politics, the landscapes, the economic conditions. In other words, stories can be conserved, but they are also adaptive and logically rewritten. And this is exactly why outcomes in this field remain and should remain probabilistic and not dogmatic. Oral traditions are not photographic records, nor a free-for-all set of dynamic narratives. They are structured, transmissible, and historically informative, but always mediated by performance, landscape, and society. I've spent much of this video talking about mythology and the story narrative, but there are other pieces of evidence that can help make the arguments of narrative preservation more plausible to doubters. And there are doubters. And this other part of the sort of algorithm of persistence is genetics. The use of ancient genomics has transformed our understanding of how people migrated to the Americas. And in 2021, researchers concluded that the initial migration of people into America came from Northeast Asia in distinct populations, and that once south of the continental ice sheets, the first people spread widely, rapidly, and diversified into multiple populations. And the research then emphasized that Antarctic peoples were a distinct and later layer. And whilst this does not prove anything about specific myths, it does strengthen the argument Berezkin puts in his paper that very old populations moved quickly into the Americas and then diversified across the enormous distance. There's other research which found that in the Upper Paleolithic, there was a Siberian individual who was called MA1, quite a popular name at the time, belonged to a population related to Western Eurasians and also genetically close to First Nation Americans, with the authors of the paper estimating a 14 to 38% First Nation American ancestry could have derived from the ancient source. Now, this does not mean Europeans peopled America. It means the Upper Paleolithic populations of Siberia were not simply stand-ins for present-day East-West divisions, and that the ancestry background behind the First Nation Americans was complex. And this complexity helps the hypothesis Berezkin puts across, as it makes it less surprising that story material associated with ancient northern populations might later look patchy or paradoxical when mapped onto much later Eurasia distributions. We also see a 2019 paper which shows analysis of 34 ancient genomes dated from 31,000 to 600 years ago, and these were found in northeastern Siberia. And these show that the region's population's history was deep and dynamic and was anything but static. And this aligns with Berezkin's view in terms of population replacement, that Central and Eastern Siberia may have undergone such major population and cultural shifts that consequently older motif complexes were thinned out or even replaced there, while surviving at the western and eastern margins of the region, and crucially in the Americas. Again, that is not proof, but it is a meaningful convergence between mythological and genomic models. And finally, there is one more paper worth mention. A 2025 study argued for genetic continuity across the last millennium and explicitly framed ancient DNA as something that can complement traditional knowledge and help mend gaps in oral history. Now, that last 1,000 years is a much shallower timescale than Berezkin's late Pleistocene horizon, so it should not be overused, but it does remind us that oral history and scientific evidence can work together. They're not chalk and cheese. They do converge. And sometimes you could say they speak to one another. And so, putting all this together, we can ask the question, what does all this mean for Homer's Odyssey? Well, interestingly, and I'm going to go slightly off topic here because this is quite interesting to me, Homer's Iliad has a similarly interesting history, which I've made a video about some time ago. But the bottom line of that is that there are such similarities between the Greek epic, the Iliad, and the epic we find in India, the Mahabharata, that coincidence is pretty much all but ruled out, which suggests that there was an older version of the story being told somewhere between India and Greece. But when and what, we don't know. But it shows that these epics were being told orally far earlier. And the Odyssey itself is older than its written form. And in it gives hints for other stories that are older than the written forms we have. For example, there's a really interesting line, literally just one line in the Odyssey, talking about Jason and the Argonauts. And whilst it's brief, the oldest version of the story we have for Jason and the Argonauts, in terms of text, is around 462 BCE, which is probably up to 300 years after the Odyssey was written by Homer. So we know that actually, even though we've got a 462 BC date for Jason and the Argonaut in terms of text, the Odyssey, which is much older, mentions it, which means the story itself is almost certainly older. And so the age of origin of these stories is really fascinating. But we also have to keep our feet on the ground. But perhaps it's better to say what this research isn't saying is that Homer preserved a 20,000-year-old story, not in a direct sense. Just that is just very difficult to evidence. But what the research does show is that the Odyssey is not an isolated case of the story, and it follows many folklore-type traits, older folklore genres, and parallels to Near Eastern myths. This is important because what Berezkin is saying is that not that the Wanderer of the Greeks is older or more original than the Wanderer of the Inuit. Instead, it is suggested that the Odyssey is a composition of layers of folklore, including influence from the Near East, but also probably many other traditions as well. And all of this folklore was probably being told as part of oral tradition long before Homer put pen to paper, so to speak. And so the origin of the Odyssey is not known per se. We can't be sure if the Inuit have influenced it, or Siberians, or Amazonians, or maybe even the Berbers. There are some answers that are more probable than others. And we're also not saying that St. George originally took shape on the west coast of North America either. None of these stories are in their original form. They all change. Stories always change. But their structure can often remain intact, or significant parts of it, where the story is considered more important to those telling and listening to it. And I've written a paper about that as well, that how people can perceive stories very differently depending on who's telling it and who's listening to it and what they believe. And I'll link that below as well. And so what we're saying is that these stories may preserve a very old human way of imagining moving through a dangerous landscape as a lone traveller in a hostile and foreign environment, a journey that is lined with monsters and monstrous tests, and at its end, a journey back home after moving through such an unpredictable landscape. The story concludes, and this story was almost certainly told by many cultures that had disappeared before the story was written down, because we think it is so very old. So this brings us to a really insightful conclusion, and Berezkin touches on this in his paper, well, mentions it for sure, which is, for those not familiar with the distribution of narratives and the motifs and myth themes, it is the suggestion that the people in North America may have done something extraordinary, something remarkable for human history. And that is that the consequences of migrations from Asia and Siberia into the Americas is that some of humanity's oldest stories, what are myths that would be from Eurasia, were in effect archived by being cut off from Eurasia by the First Nation American people. Now, this archiving isn't perfect, it's not without fault, it is not a library, but fragments of some myths and significant parts of others are preserved with far more consistency than they were in Eurasia. And part of the reason for this is that the early population of the Americas developed outside of the literary and religious and folk tale scattered landscape of Eurasia. And so some of the older motifs were allowed to persist with little change to their structure. In effect, listening to First Nation American stories not only illuminates our understanding of their early culture, but it may also cast a light onto some long-lost motifs within Eurasian prehistory. There will, well, of course, always be people saying that this is overreach or just not believing this. And for now, at least, this is an hypothesis. It's a theory. It's not absolutely true. But the idea, the hypothesis, isn't a frivolous one. We're not saying that there's a hidden labyrinth under the pyramids, something strange like that. What we're saying is anchored around real data that you can all read and view and analyze. It is a data set that is aligned with linguistic and genetic and archaeological information. And with all this, I feel the typical rejections of comparative mythology that I receive, well, many of them, most of them, can be put aside, which in turn means that more people should be interested in the possibilities here. We often consider that whilst human civilization, is well preserved, we consider all tradition to be fragile. But both Berezkin and myself and many others in the computational comparative mythological field, well, we put it that oral tradition is perhaps far stronger than most people possibly imagine. Yes, some stories are overwritten. The centres of literacy may overwrite older stories, but preservation can remain in the outer edges, on the boundaries. The margins remember what the centre forgets. Now, to finish off, I'm sure many of you want to know, did the Greek story of the Odyssey borrow from the First Nation Americans? But as I sort of hinted at, this is the wrong question. What if before there were Greeks and Inuit and Athapaskans and Amazonians, what if before these people were in cultural groups that we know them by, there already existed a story of a world filled with dangerous journeys, monstrous females, cunning escapes, devouring landscapes, all experienced by a lone wanderer? What if This story broke apart as humans migrated across Eurasia and into the Americas. And what if what we see, what we have left, it's not a single copy, but various raindrops collected from a storm of stories. In the one, Kiviok in his kayak, rowing away from the monstrous beings, another, Odysseus is blown towards an island where the Cyclops awaits, and another, the wanderer is no longer vulnerable but strong and sets species and landscapes and other humans into their final form. But in all of these stories, the journey at its core is the same. The adventurer experiences the strange world, survives the impossible, and then returns, having made the other place a somewhat better place. This story is not just a folktale. It is a sum of theology and metaphor and psychology. It may remember human journeys so old that it survives just in the shape of this story, all before there were books and maps, when there were just coastlines and migrations. So long before the Odyssey was written down, there may have already been a traveller who had wandered through an unknown landscape, escaping danger and outwitting or defeating monsters. And his journey became one of the oldest stories we still tell today.